A crimson mark where no blood should be welcome to whispered clues. Where are you listening from tonight? Your presence keeps these mysteries alive. Now, let us step quietly into the case. A single crimson mark upon an ancient altar. What secret could it hold? Welcome to Whispered Clues. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Your presence sharpens every clue. Now, let us begin the case. It was on a brisk March morning that I found myself once more seated opposite Sherlock Holmes in our familiar quarters at 221B Baker Street. The windows were partially fogged with the remnants of last night's rain, and the coal fire hissed softly in the grate. Holmes was ensconced in his armchair, pipe in hand, his expression one of that curious abstraction which meant some mental process was well underway. I'd been thumbing through the Times when a soft knock interrupted the silence. Mrs. Hudson entered with her usual polite firmness. "A Reverend Josiah Merton to see you, Mr. Holmes," she said, glancing from Holmes to me and back. Holmes tapped the ash from his pipe and stood. "Show him in, Mrs. Hudson. And please, some tea, if you will." The man who entered was striking, though not in the physical sense. He was gaunt, with the sunken cheeks of a man more acquainted with sleepless prayer than hearty meals. His collar was high and starched, his eyes red-rimmed, not from drink but from some inner grief that gnawed at the soul. He clasped a worn black hat in his thin hands, and greeted Holmes with a voice both strained and tremulous. "Mr. Holmes, I come not with a tale of murder, but of something unclean, something that chills the very air within my church." Holmes gestured to the armchair. "Please, Reverend. Sit, tell us everything." The man lowered himself with care. "I am rector of St. Ethelstan's, a modest but ancient parish near Hampstead Heath. Last Sunday, following evensong, I remained behind to tidy some hymnals. That's when I noticed it. A blot, dark, sinister, on the altar stone. It was blood, Mr. Holmes. Blood upon the sacred stone." "Could it not have been spilled wine?" I offered, earning only a glance from Holmes. "I know the difference, Doctor. I've spent over 2 decades in that church. The stain was fresh, not there earlier in the day. And it was deliberate, not spattered but pooled, as if something had bled there." Holmes leaned forward. Was there any indication of forced entry? "None. The vestry doors were locked. Only I and Mrs. Padley, the housekeeper, hold the keys. The windows were latched, the tower door bolted from the inside." Holmes steepled his fingers. "A locked room bloodstain on an altar. Most unorthodox. Has this occurred before?" The Reverend hesitated. "No, but something else has." He drew from his coat a folded parchment and handed it to Holmes. "This was found under the altar cloth. I daren't read it aloud in my own house of worship." Holmes took the paper with delicate fingers and unfolded it. I leaned forward to glimpse the content, and even my untrained eye recognized it as some sort of ritual. Script, written in an archaic Latin hand, with symbols that seemed to crawl across the page. Holmes's eyes twinkled with grim interest. "You were right not to read it aloud. Whoever wrote this intended it to be found, but only by those who could decipher its implications. This is no juvenile prank, Reverend. I fear, Mr. Holmes, that something profane has occurred within those walls, and if it continues—" He broke off, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. Holmes rose. "You've done the right thing in coming to me. Dr. Watson and I shall call upon St. Ethelstan's before Vespers today. Please make no mention of our visit to anyone in the parish, not even your housekeeper. I require the church to remain undisturbed." The Reverend stood, visibly relieved. "Thank you. I trust your discretion." He bowed slightly and departed, his steps no less burdened by the weight of mystery. Holmes stood at the hearth, staring into the flames. "Watson, this is not a case of murder, at least not yet, but it may well become one. You believe someone is using the church for unholy purposes?" Holmes turned to me, his expression unreadable. I believe someone wants the Reverend to believe that. Whether the intent is to unseat him, disgrace the church, or distract us from something more sinister, I do not yet know. But blood on an altar stone is rarely the first act in a play. By 4 o'clock, we arrived at St. Ethelstan's. The church stood aloof from the road, encircled by ancient yews, whose roots curled like arthritic fingers through the soil of the old cemetery. The nave was dimly lit by coloured panes of weathered stained glass. The air was cold and still, almost too still. Reverend Merton met us at the vestibule and led us in silence to the chancel. Holmes approached the altar with reverence, pulling on a pair of thin gloves. He examined the stone carefully, crouching beside it. "There," the Reverend whispered. "It has faded some, but the outline remains." Indeed it did. A dark, irregular patch, circular, perhaps 3 inches wide, near the center of the altar slab. Holmes took out a small lens and peered closer. "Watson, note the borders. No splatter, no drips. Controlled, and the surface has been disturbed recently." "Reverend, who cleaned this?" "I tried scrubbing it the morning after, but it would not lift fully." Holmes turned his attention to the cloth beneath the altar, then to the floor. He sniffed once, sharply. "Candle wax. Recently melted." He rose and moved to the east wall. There, behind the pulpit, was a brass plaque depicting an angelic figure with an outstretched arm. Holmes tapped it lightly. "Hollow," he murmured. "And yet I see no sign of a seam or opening." He stepped back and surveyed the church with narrowed eyes. "Watson," he said, "do you feel it? The sensation that something here is staged, like a theater just after the audience has left, but the actors remain unseen." I nodded. There was something oppressive about the silence, the stillness, as if the air itself remembered something dreadful. Holmes turned back to the Reverend. "We shall return tomorrow before dawn. I must observe this place before the world has stirred. Reverend, leave it untouched until then." The man nodded solemnly. "I shall." As we stepped back out into the fog and the rustling trees, Holmes muttered under his breath, "Blood on the altar, a ritual note, and no sign of entry. There's an actor in this drama, Watson, playing to a script written in shadow." "And do you know who?" Holmes lit his pipe and inhaled deeply. "Not yet, but the play has only begun." It was a peculiar chill that met us at 4:30 the following morning, as Holmes and I stood before the iron gate of St. Ethelstan's. The fog hung thick and low, a sea of pale smoke curling along the ground, muffling sound and sharpening every shadow. Holmes, swathed in his long ulster and scarf, had been unusually quiet during our handsome ride, his brow furrowed in deep thought, fingers tapping a silent rhythm on the silver head of his cane. "Watson," he said as we approached the lich gate, "there are moments in a case where the world must be observed not as it is, but as it pretends not to be." Before I could press him for clarification, the church door opened with a reluctant creak, and Reverend Merton appeared, cloaked and somber, holding a brass lamp whose flicker only deepened the hollowness beneath his eyes. "Thank you for your discretion, Reverend," Holmes said. "You may return to your quarters now. Dr. Watson and I will remain here for the hour." The clergyman hesitated. "Are you expecting someone?" "Not precisely," Holmes replied. "But I am watching for something or someone that does not wish to be seen." Reluctantly, Merton turned and disappeared into the vicarage, leaving us alone with the echoes of the sleeping nave. Inside, the church was cold as a crypt. The air tasted of ancient dust and tallow. Holmes moved with deliberate care, his steps nearly silent across the flagstone floor. He crouched behind the front pews, eyes fixed upon the altar. I followed suit, pulling my coat tighter around me. For what must have been nearly an hour, we sat in the stillness, the only sound the slow tick of the church's brass wall clock. I began to wonder whether Holmes's instincts had misfired, when he stiffened beside me. "Listen," he whispered. At first I heard nothing, then a faint scraping, barely perceptible. It came from the rear vestry. Holmes rose without a sound, beckoning me to remain. He disappeared into the side aisle like a wraith. I sat tensely, heart thudding in my chest. Minutes passed. Then a sudden clatter, the muffled sound of boots on stone, and Holmes calling, "This way, Watson!" I sprang to my feet and rushed through the chancel. Holmes had already burst into the vestry and flung open the rear door. A figure darted into the churchyard beyond, a dark silhouette against the pale dawn fog. Holmes gave chase, his footsteps quick and light despite the uneven terrain. I followed, lungs burning. The figure ducked behind gravestones, heading toward the rear wall. Holmes was gaining, but just before he could seize the fugitive, the figure leapt over the crumbling boundary fence and vanished into the thicket beyond. Holmes halted and raised his hand. "Let him go," he said, breathing steadily. He was prepared, no doubt had an escape route marked. I caught up, panting. "Did you see his face?" "No, but I saw something better." He held up a small object, a scrap of cloth torn from the man's coat during the brief pursuit. It was dark velvet, the corner of what appeared to be a ceremonial robe, stitched with a peculiar silver thread in the shape of a spiral, an ancient druidic sigil if my classical education served me correctly. We returned to the vestry. Holmes examined the door and nodded. Forced from within. The latch had been delicately filed to appear intact. A clever trick, until he panicked. Back inside the nave, Holmes retraced the man's path with a lantern. He knelt at the altar and sniffed the air once more. "Watson, bring me the lamp." I held it aloft as he examined the base of the altar stone. With delicate fingers, he found a groove in the mortar, a hidden seam. With the tip of his penknife, he pried it open. A stone slab lifted slightly, revealing a recess no larger than a book. Inside it, wrapped in cloth, was a small bottle, half full of dark liquid. "Blood?" I asked. "Likely. But we'll have it tested. More interesting is the container. Look." The bottle bore a wax seal marked not with a manufacturer's stamp, but with an impression of an old ecclesiastical sigil. Crossed keys beneath a sunburst, overlaid with a diagonal bar. "Unregistered?" Holmes muttered. "This is no apothecary's work. And look, burnt residue on the cloth. He meant to destroy it. He returned this morning to remove the evidence." As Holmes packed the cloth and bottle carefully into his bag, he gestured to the rear pulpit. "Let's take a closer look behind that plaque." We moved once more to the eastern wall. With my help and a bit of leverage, Holmes managed to loosen the brass memorial. Behind it, wedged into the brickwork, was a small iron key, old and rusted but still intact. Holmes turned it over in his hand. "Not a church key. Look at the ridging. It's ornate, symbolic. This belongs to something ceremonial, possibly a crypt or a reliquary." I shivered. "You think there's more hidden beneath the church?" "I think someone does," Holmes said quietly. "And they're trying to retrieve it under the guise of desecration. But to what end?" Just then, the early sun broke through the fog, casting long stained-glass shadows along the nave. Holmes stood in the kaleidoscopic light, his profile etched in blue and crimson. "We must learn who has access to this place beyond the Reverend and his housekeeper. There is more than superstition at work here, Watson. We are dealing with someone who uses the language of ritual to cloak his true intent." As we stepped out into the emerging daylight, I asked, "Do you believe this is connected to some ancient sect? A revivalist cult?" Holmes smiled thinly. "I believe it is connected to something far more mundane, though no less dangerous. And like all good plays, the villain will take the stage when the time is ripe." We climbed back into the waiting hansom, the torn scrap of robe and the sealed bottle nestled in Holmes's satchel like cursed artifacts awaiting interpretation. Holmes struck a match to relight his pipe. Today We call upon Lestrade. I blinked. You wish to bring in Scotland Yard already? Not for assistance, Holmes said, but for distraction. Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard arrived at Baker Street precisely at 11:30, punctual as ever, and wearing an expression that could curdle cream. He brought with him the damp scent of London's mid-morning drizzle and the familiar scuff of police boots on polished floorboards. Holmes, lounging on the settee with a violin across his knees, made no immediate acknowledgement, instead continuing a delicate pizzicato as if summoning a revelation through the strings. Lestrade cleared his throat. "Well, Holmes, your note said urgent matter requiring absolute discretion. And yet here I find you serenading the wallpaper." Holmes set the violin down. "Ah, Lestrade, you mistake silence for inactivity. Some of my finest deductions have arrived to the tune of Paganini. Tea?" "No, thank you." The inspector remained standing. "Now, what's this about a church and blood on an altar?" Holmes gestured to the armchair opposite him. "Do sit. This concerns St. Ethelstan's in Hampstead. Dr. Watson and I observed something deeply troubling, a desecration cloaked in symbolism and executed with alarming precision. We also encountered an intruder, fleet of foot and well-prepared, who escaped but left behind this." He produced the torn scrap of embroidered velvet and placed it delicately on the table. Lestrade peered at it. "Ritual garb." "Precisely. We also discovered a sealed bottle of blood hidden beneath the altar stone. Watson has already sent a sample to Bart's for analysis." The inspector frowned. "You're suggesting some kind of cult activity? I'll admit, we've seen stranger, but blood and symbols? Sounds like theatrics." Holmes raised a finger. "That is exactly the veil behind which our villain hides, and I need you, Lestrade, to apply a little pressure." "Pressure?" Holmes leaned forward. "I need the parish's vestry ledgers. Seized. Officially. Say it's a review of ecclesiastical property records if you must, but I want access to every name who has entered the church in the past month. Visitors, workmen, choristers, all of them." Lestrade sighed. "You know how fond the clergy are of police inquiries." "Precisely why your badge is more effective than my violin," Holmes replied. "One more thing. I'd like your man Hopkins to quietly interview the housekeeper, Mrs. Padley. She may know more than she's allowed herself to realize." Lestrade nodded reluctantly. "I'll put it in motion, but if this turns out to be some theatrical prank, then I'll buy you supper at Simpson's and humbly polish your boots," Holmes replied. "But I rather think this leads deeper than a prank, possibly quite literally." That afternoon, Holmes and I returned to St. Ethelstan's under the pretense of architectural interest, while Lestrade, cloaked in official purpose, examined the ledgers. The Reverend had agreed to our presence, but kept mostly to his study, leaving us free to examine the nave in peace. Holmes, his eyes never still, retraced the length of the altar and paused near the southern transept. "Watson," he said softly, "note this tile here." I stepped beside him. One of the slate floor tiles was newer than the others, subtly darker and without the weathered texture of its neighbors. Holmes knelt and produced a folding rule. 3 1/4 inches thick, just enough for a void beneath. "See the faint chisel marks?" He tapped the tile gently. It emitted a slightly hollower tone. "Too risky to pry it open now," Holmes murmured. "But I suspect we've found our villain's second hiding place." We returned to the vestry, where Lestrade had laid out 3 thick volumes of handwritten entries. Holmes thumbed through them with surgical precision. "These are the entries for all non-parish events," Lestrade said. "Rehearsals, choir practice, outside guests." Holmes stopped at a page dated 2 weeks prior. "Here, Mr. Phineas Dreck, by arrangement of choir master. Organ inspection. Signed by Reverend Merton." "Dreck," I repeated. "An uncommon name." "Too uncommon," Holmes muttered. "Let's see what else he's inspected." He flipped further. The same name appeared again. this time under a vague entry. Chancel repairs and light testing, Drek present for assessment. Yet no repairs were ordered, Holmes said, tapping the entry. Watson, does that not seem peculiar? Indeed, I replied. Merton mentioned no such inspection. Because it wasn't genuine. Our friend Drek has used his credentials, or forged them, to gain access multiple times. Now, who recommended this Drek? Lestrade tapped a note at the margin. Here. Introduced via Mr. Henry Latchfield, bass singer, chorister. Holmes's eyes lit with interest. Watson, do you recall the brass key we recovered behind the plaque? The ridges were ceremonial, almost heraldic. Suppose this Mr. Latchfield is part of an older tradition, one not entirely spiritual. You think he's the real link? I think he's the first willing actor, Holmes said. We must speak with him. Lestrade? The inspector nodded. I'll have him brought in. Holmes paused. No, let us go to him. Observe him in his setting. That evening we arrived at the residence of Henry Latchfield, a neat row house in Islington, red brick and ivy-wrapped. The front garden was immaculately kept, though the topiary was oddly shaped, geometrical, unnatural, clipped not with taste but with ritualistic precision. A woman answered the door, tall, stooped, and pallid. Yes? She asked. Mr. Latchfield, Holmes inquired. The woman's gaze sharpened. He is at choir rehearsal. May I ask your names? Holmes offered a courteous bow. Merely parish associates. We'll return tomorrow. As we turned, Holmes whispered, That was no housekeeper. That was Latchfield's sister or cousin, too familiar, too nervous. And did you see the wax residue near the door frame? Sealing wax? I asked. Exactly. Black and used recently. They've received something. Or sent something. Likely both. We retreated a few paces and circled to the alley. Holmes peered through the rear window, then gestured to me. The room inside was dim, lit only by a low lamp. On the desk was a circle of stones, some pale grey, some dark, and within it lay an open journal. But what drew Holmes's eye was the symbol carved into the wood beneath the journal, a spiral of intersecting lines, identical to the sigil on the torn velvet scrap. Holmes' voice was low and sharp. Watson, we are no longer dealing with mimicry of ritual. We are dealing with a man who believes in what he practices. I swallowed. And if so, then whatever lies beneath that church is no longer just a hiding place for relics. It's a stage prepared for something yet to come. We returned to Baker Street well past 9, the last of the evening fog curling along the cobbles like a cat seeking warmth. Holmes, uncharacteristically silent during the entire cab ride, stared fixedly at the passing street lamps, his brows knitted in intense thought. I knew better than to interrupt. Once inside, he flung off his coat and made directly for his files, pulling out a battered leather folder marked DL Obscure Ritual Societies. He began flipping through it with quick, precise fingers until he stopped at a woodcut sketch of a symbol, a spiral cross hatched with intersecting bars. He held it up beside the scrap of velvet retrieved from the altar. The resemblance was undeniable. Watson, he said, we may be facing the resurgence of an esoteric sect once thought extinct. I leaned closer. A cult? Holmes nodded slowly. Known in fragmented ecclesiastical records as the Custodians of the Third Veil. They were a secretive brotherhood believed to have existed in the early 17th century. Not demonic, nothing so theatrical, but deeply invested in the preservation of what they called the sacred reversal. And what in heaven's name is that? A doctrine claiming that the spiritual power of places can be inverted, turned upon themselves through precise acts of desecration. The blood on the altar, the hidden ritual object, the manipulation of sacred geometry, it all matches. The spiral is key, symbolizing a path inward, beneath. I shivered. You believe our man, Latchfield, is part of this? Not just part. Possibly the architect. And if so, there must be something hidden beneath the church that they intend to access. Holmes rose and retrieved the iron key we'd discovered behind the brass plaque. This key wasn't buried randomly. It was placed behind an angelic figure, symbolically masking the profane with the sacred. I believe it opens something older than any parish register. Something forgotten. He lit his pipe and sat by the hearth. Tomorrow we pay another visit to St. Ethelstan's before sunrise. This time we investigate the southern transept tile. Quietly. At 4:30 the following morning, beneath a sky barely bruised with dawn, Holmes and I once again crept into the silent church. Reverend Merton had granted us a spare key, trusting Holmes's insistence that the fewer people who knew of this intrusion, the better. Inside, all was still. The stale chill of stone, the scent of candle soot and lingering incense. Holmes led us down the nave to the southern transept, where the oddly replaced tile still waited in mute defiance. Holmes knelt, withdrew a small iron crowbar from beneath his coat, and began working the seam. The mortar had been painted to match the others, recently, though not expertly. With a sharp crack, the tile lifted. Beneath was a narrow void, no more than a foot deep, and within it, a small iron box. Its surface was mottled with rust, its corners rounded from age. Holmes gingerly withdrew it, placed it on the stone, and examined the lock. "Symbol matches," he said, inserting the old key. With a click, the box opened. Inside lay several items: a folded length of parchment, a curved bone talisman etched with runes, and, most strikingly, a locket containing a miniature portrait. Faded, but recognizably female, perhaps 30 years of age. The woman wore a silver crucifix, and a faint smile touched her lips. Holmes carefully unfolded the parchment. "Latin," he murmured. "A prayer, but distorted. Domine reversum lumen ad tenebras. Lord, return the light to darkness." He glanced up at me. "This is no idle curiosity. Someone has preserved this as a kind of relic, an artifact of a faith twisted inward." I gestured to the portrait. "Who is she?" "Unknown. But she may be the key to this entire performance. A figure of veneration, or perhaps sacrifice." Holmes closed the box carefully. "We'll have it examined further. But this confirms it, Watson. Something very old, very intentional, is unfolding here." As we returned the tile and wiped away any signs of entry, I could not shake the sensation of being watched. The shadows between the pews seemed deeper, and even the muted colors of the stained glass felt less benign in the half-light. As we locked the door behind us and stepped out into the dawn, Holmes paused and turned back to the church facade. "The actor is nearing his final scene," he murmured. "The stage is nearly set." Later that morning, Inspector Lestrade rejoined us at Baker Street, his brow damp from haste and worry. "I've spoken to the choir master," he said without ceremony. "Latchfield's been absent for 2 days now. No word, no warning. His sister claims he's visiting Oxford, but there's no record of it at the train station, and no one's seen him leave." Holmes gave a grim nod. "He's in hiding, or preparing something. What of Mrs. Padley?" Lestrade pulled out his notebook. "Curious woman, very guarded, but one thing she let slip. She said that once, a year or so ago, she caught Latchfield in the bell tower, alone after midnight. He claimed he was listening for the harmonics of the stone. Sounded like nonsense to her, so she didn't mention it." Holmes's eyes glittered. "Not nonsense. The bell tower connects to the sub-foundation. Some ancient churches were built atop older sites, pre-Christian even. If our man was measuring echoes, he was looking for a hollow, an entrance." "An entrance to what?" I asked, half dreading the answer. "To whatever lies beneath the altar and predates the church itself," Holmes replied. "I suspect that tonight is their culmination, the final act in this macabre play." Lestrade shifted uncomfortably. Then we'll need men stationed at the church. No, Holmes said sharply. They'll only scare him off. We need him to act, to reveal the full extent of the operation. Let him begin. Then we move. Lestrade frowned but relented. Then what's the plan? Holmes turned to me. Watson and I will return this evening, concealed. Once Latchfield arrives, or whoever takes his place, we intercept. But I need you, Lestrade, to wait outside the church perimeter with 2 men hidden near the rear vestry entrance. When I signal, 3 knocks on the south door. You move in. Lestrade nodded. And what if he doesn't come? Holmes's mouth curved in a humorless smile. He'll come. He's waited too long. The stage is lit. The audience is seated. He cannot help but appear. The evening of March 14th arrived beneath a bruised sky, its clouds heavy with unshed rain and the promise of thunder. London held its breath in that peculiar hush that precedes a storm, and as Holmes and I approached the darkened silhouette of St. Ethelstan's, the air was thick with anticipation. The church loomed like a shipwreck from some forgotten epoch, its bell tower cutting against the clouds like a watchful spear. Holmes had donned a plain black overcoat, the collar turned up high, and he moved with a silence that would have made a pickpocket envious. I followed close behind, our boots muffled by the damp grass as we crept through the graveyard at the side of the nave. Lestrade and his men had arrived an hour earlier and taken their positions, silent shadows near the boundary wall and vestry exit, invisible to all but the moon. Watson, Holmes whispered, pausing near a yew tree whose limbs bent like old limbs in prayer, we shall conceal ourselves in the old organ loft. It offers a commanding view of both the altar and the vestry door, and more importantly, it has the acoustics to betray the slightest whisper. Inside, the church was cloaked in darkness. Holmes produced a shuttered lantern from his coat and led the way up a narrow staircase, the wood groaning faintly beneath our steps. The organ loft smelled of dust, wax, and old hymnals. From our vantage, we could see the nave below, the altar dimly lit by the afterglow of the stained glass window above it, still catching the last violet traces of twilight. Holmes settled beside me, eyes gleaming as he trained his spyglass on the chancel. He'll come when he believes all eyes are elsewhere, he murmured. A coward, even one cloaked in ritual, is still bound by fear. We waited. Time moved slowly in the belly of the church. Somewhere beyond the walls, a fox screamed and a distant train gave a mournful whistle. My knees ached from the stone floor and my breath fogged faintly in the cold. But Holmes remained still, the patience of a hunting owl carved into his frame. Then it came. A faint creak, the nave's great door opening just enough to admit a man's form. He was wrapped in a dark cloak, his gait careful and reverent, as though walking among tombs. Holmes raised one finger in warning. We remained utterly still. The man passed beneath us, moving slowly toward the altar. His hood fell back, revealing the pale, sharp features of Henry Latchfield. In his hands, he carried a velvet pouch and a small iron rod, gleaming faintly in the gloom. He moved with purpose. At the altar, he knelt, not in prayer, but in preparation. From the pouch he drew several objects, a small obsidian shard, a copper medallion etched with spirals, and a long white feather. He placed them in a precise pattern upon the stone. Holmes leaned close. A ritual, he murmured, but not for worship, for unlocking. Latchfield then drew the iron rod and touched it to the altar's surface. He muttered something, too faint to hear, but Holmes, whose Latin was razor-sharp, whispered a translation as the words rose faintly. "Open the mouth of stone, that the way be made clear." And then a shift. Not loud, not dramatic, but the altar stone emitted a sound like a sigh, a hiss of stone on stone. A small panel in its base slid aside, revealing a narrow aperture. Latchfield smiled. Holmes moved. In a blink, he was gone from the loft, moving like a shadow down the back stair. I followed as quickly as I dared, nearly tripping on my coat as I scrambled after him. By the time I reached the nave, Holmes had already circled behind the pulpit. But it was too late. Latchfield sensed it. Whether by instinct or misstep, he whirled around, eyes wide, and bolted for the bell tower. Holmes cursed under his breath. "Watson, the trap door!" I lunged for the altar, but Holmes waved me off. "Follow me, quickly!" We charged after Latchfield as he fled through the side passage, his cloak flapping like a raven's wing. He vanished up the spiral staircase that led to the tower's highest chamber. Each step echoed like a gunshot. Holmes didn't hesitate. He knows the church. But so do we now. We climbed, breath short and hearts pounding, the stairs twisted tightly, the air thinning, the walls growing colder. At the top, the bell tower opened like a black lung. Moonlight spilled through an arched opening where a great iron bell loomed in silence. Latchfield stood just beneath it, panting, a hammer in his hand. "Don't come closer," he barked. "You don't understand. It's older than the church. It demands the ritual." Holmes raised a hand. "Henry, listen to yourself. You've desecrated a place of peace, cloaked your crimes in mystery, and for what? What lies beneath that altar?" Latchfield's eyes were fever bright. "It is not a crime. It is a duty. We are guardians. The veil must be opened before the equinox, before it seals for another 100 years. Holmes stepped forward. "And if it seals?" "It takes one of us instead," Latchfield whispered. "It always takes one." Holmes nodded once. "Then let it take the right man." And with that, Lestrade and his men surged up the stair behind us, revolvers raised. Latchfield froze, the hammer slipping from his fingers. "No," he howled. "You've doomed us all." The officers restrained him, dragging him down the stair as he ranted of seals, light reversals, and blood. Back in the nave, Holmes examined the stone aperture Latchfield had opened. It led to a stair, narrow and slick with age, descending into darkness. But Holmes did not descend, not yet. Instead, he turned to Lestrade. "He didn't act alone. We need to find who prepared that ritual, who taught him." Lestrade, breathless but steady, nodded. "I'll have his sister brought in." Holmes looked back at the altar, then to me. "Tomorrow, Watson. We descend tomorrow. Whatever lies beneath must be understood, not just stopped." The following morning dawned with reluctant sunlight, a pale veil across the streets of London that did little to dispel the night's peculiar unease. Holmes and I returned to St. Ethelstan's just past 6 o'clock, accompanied only by the steady clink of his walking stick against the flagstones and the distant toll of a city stirring from slumber. The church was locked, silent, but the key was in our possession. The altar stone had been resealed by Lestrade's men after the arrest, but Holmes had arranged for its access to be granted again. This time officially, though not yet publicly. Reverend Merton greeted us at the nave door, haggard and trembling despite a brave attempt at composure. "I must confess, Mr. Holmes," he said, "I barely slept. I do not understand what's happening in my church. What force has been awakened?" Holmes gave him a reassuring nod. "You are not alone in your confusion, Reverend, but I promise you this, before the day is out, you shall know the truth, and it will be mortal, not mystical." The clergyman nodded and retreated to his study. Holmes turned to me. "Watson, if I should fall through rotted steps or find myself suddenly sealed inside an underground vault, I trust you to fetch a rope and a constable." "Hardly the encouragement I hoped for," I muttered, tightening my scarf as we returned to the altar. With care, Holmes levered open the concealed panel beneath the slab, revealing once more the narrow aperture and the winding staircase carved into the bedrock. It exhaled a breath of cold, stale air that spoke of centuries untouched. Holmes lit a lantern, its orange glow pushing back the darkness only a few feet at a time. "After you," he said dryly, and I sighed, taking the first tentative step. The descent was slow. The spiral steps were damp with condensation, worn to uneven curves by generations of use or misuse. Moss clung to the walls, and strange markings, some religious, others less easily classified, were faintly visible beneath the grime. After perhaps 20 feet, the stair ended at a narrow corridor no wider than a coffin. Its air was still, heavy with dust and decay. Holmes raised the lantern. "There," he said, pointing to a door set into the far wall, a low arch of stone sealed not with a modern lock, but with iron bands bound by a rusted mechanism. The key, our iron relic recovered days earlier, fit the lock perfectly. With a heavy click it turned. The door groaned open. Beyond lay a chamber neither of us had expected. It was not a crypt in the usual sense, not a tomb, not a vault of bones. Rather, it resembled a sanctum, a subterranean chapel, long forgotten. The walls were lined with faded murals, none biblical, but rather symbolic, spirals, eclipses, figures with covered eyes and outstretched hands. The altar here was stone as well, unadorned, but its surface was cracked, and something long buried had been recently disturbed. Holmes stepped forward and crouched beside a broken tile at the base of the rear wall. "Someone's been here recently. Look, dust displaced, fibers of cloth caught on the edge." He held up a shred of velvet, identical to the piece torn from Latchfield's cloak. In the far corner of the chamber stood a lectern, and upon it a thick volume bound in dark leather. Holmes approached and opened it with care. Dust rose in a puff as the old pages surrendered their secrets. "It's a register," he murmured. "Not of the church, but of the Vale." He turned the pages slowly. Names, dates, rituals, descriptions of trials and offerings. "See here," the light reversed beneath the chancel, the host accepted, the seal reinforced. He tapped the next line. "Should the rite be interrupted, the seal demands substitution." I swallowed. "Substitution?" Holmes nodded grimly. "A life, Watson. Latchfield was no mere heretic. He believed, truly believed, that unless he completed this ritual, something terrible would be unleashed or required." He turned to the back of the book. The last page had been half filled in a modern hand, one I recognized from our viewing of the vestry records. "It's Latchfield's entry," Holmes said. "Dated 4 days ago. Prepared the signs, procured the blood, set the anchor with her likeness." "Her?" I asked. Holmes pulled from his coat the miniature portrait found in the iron box. He held it next to the script. "I believe this woman, whoever she was used as an anchor, perhaps an ancestral link, or perhaps a previous sacrifice commemorated as a charm against collapse." He pocketed both items and moved to a shallow recess in the wall. There, half hidden beneath a tattered cloth, lay a small wooden crate. Holmes opened it. Inside was a simple cross, silver, etched with strange markings, and beneath it, a vial of reddish fluid sealed with the same sigil we'd seen before. He held them up. Tokens. Part of the rite. Without them, the reversal cannot be completed, which means whatever Latchfield planned has now failed, or has been paused. We remained in silence for a moment, the dim orange light casting our shadows across walls no living person had seen for decades. Then Holmes turned sharply. "We've seen enough. Let us reseal this place and return to daylight before some other believer tries to finish what Latchfield began." Back in Baker Street later that morning, Holmes sat quietly at the desk, the register open before him and the silver cross resting beside his teacup. He examined each item with the methodical care of a surgeon or a watchmaker. "Watson," he said at length, "religion often leaves us baffled because it deals in the unseen, but what fascinates me more are those who counterfeit religion, who dress deception in the garments of belief." "You mean Latchfield?" "Yes, and perhaps others. I believe he was indoctrinated, possibly from youth. The symbols, the doctrines, the relics, they formed a narrative he could not escape. But someone supplied those tools. Someone guided his hand. I frowned. His sister? Possibly. But there's another name that appeared in the Vale's register, scribbled over and then re-entered. R.G. We must determine who that is. And you think they're still active? Holmes looked up. Watson, belief is the most dangerous fuel in the world. It can keep a man moving long after reason has deserted him. Yes, I believe R.G. is very much alive, and he may not have abandoned the ritual at all. He may simply be waiting for a more willing vessel. The morning passed in investigative quiet at Baker Street, save for the rustling of papers and the occasional clink of Holmes's teacup against its saucer. I occupied myself with reorganizing my notes on the case, attempting to distill some semblance of chronology from the swirl of ritual symbols, secret staircases, and cryptic doctrines. Meanwhile, Holmes sat hunched over the register we'd recovered from the subterranean chapel, eyes darting from page to page, pausing every so often to make a notation in his own hand. "There's a pattern here, Watson," he said suddenly, not looking up. "To the rituals?" "No, to the names. Look here." He turned the register so I could see. Most are signed with full names or initials followed by dates, but these, see the ones spaced at intervals of roughly 27 years, are marked R.G., and each one coincides with a record of a reversal attempt, or what the cult calls a veiling rite. I leaned closer. But those dates go back over a century. That's impossible, unless we're dealing with a man well into his second century. "Not impossible," Holmes murmured, "just implausible. More likely, R.G. is a title, or an inherited alias, passed from one believer to another, like a mantle. The Reverend Guide, perhaps. Or Ritual Guardian. Or Repeating Ghoul," I muttered, drawing a rare smirk from Holmes. He pushed back from the desk and stood. The most recent R.G. entry was dated 5 years ago, long after Latchfield joined the choir. We need to know who initiated him and who remains in the shadows. Just then, Mrs. Hudson knocked gently and entered with a calling card upon a silver tray. "For you, Mr. Holmes," she said, her expression tight. "A rather odd man at the door. Wouldn't give his full name, but said you'd understand." Holmes took the card, frowned, and held it up to the light. Embossed in gold ink were only 3 characters. R.G. He met my eyes. "It seems we are to be visited by the ghost himself." The man who entered our sitting room moments later was not what I expected. He was tall, gaunt, and dressed in a plain grey overcoat with an immaculately knotted cravat. His hair was silver, cropped close, and his face bore the peculiar hollowness of someone perpetually in mourning. Yet his eyes, sharp, pale blue, were anything but defeated. They moved with the speed of a man who calculated every moment 3 steps ahead. "Mr. Holmes," he said in a soft, deliberate voice, "I apologize for the intrusion. I would have sent word sooner, but I had hoped this entire matter might pass without my involvement." Holmes did not rise. "And yet here you are, Mr. The man smiled faintly. "You may call me Gregory. That is not my true name, of course. But names, as you have likely gathered, are fluid in my line of work. I presume you are the R.G. noted in the chapel ledger." "Indeed. The title is passed down, ritually, though not mystically, I assure you. I held it from 1872 until 3 years ago. I am here because the current holder, my successor, has violated our principles." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Your principles involve the bloodletting of sacred spaces, ancient rituals, and a potential human sacrifice." Gregory shook his head. "No, Mr. Holmes, that is a corruption, a mutation of our original aim. We were not always a secret society. We began as caretakers, preservers of knowledge predating organized faith. The spiral is not a symbol of darkness, but of balance. The reversal was never meant to summon anything, but to remind us that all light casts shadow. It is the deluded who twist belief into horror. Latchfield was one of your own, I said. Gregory looked at me sadly. He was brought in by my successor. Against my warning, that man, who now calls himself Gideon, was obsessed with returning to the original ways. He believed in blood, in sacrifice. I stepped down when it became clear I could not stop him from within. Holmes leaned forward. Then why come now? Because you have disrupted him, Gregory said. The rite at St. Ethelstan's was meant to coincide with the vernal equinox, tomorrow night. When Latchfield was arrested, Gideon vanished, but he will not give up. He will relocate the rite. There are other sanctuaries. Holmes narrowed his eyes. And you know where? Gregory hesitated, then nodded. There is a place, an abandoned priory in Surrey, beneath a hill called Crowsmere. We used it during my tenure for philosophical gatherings. If Gideon intends to complete the reversal, it will be there. And why help us? I asked. Because if he succeeds, even in appearance, others will follow. We have always kept the spiral coiled, quiet, inward. Gideon seeks to unwind it. Holmes stood. Then we leave within the hour. Gregory inclined his head. I will accompany you part of the way, but I dare not be seen on the grounds. Then tell us what to expect. Gregory's voice dropped. The priory's entrance lies beneath the stone base of a ruined sundial. The sanctuary is far larger than the chapel beneath St. Ethelstan's. The central chamber is marked by a circular dais ringed in old iron symbols. If the rite begins, you must interrupt the spiral itself. Break the circle. That is the only way to halt the progression. Holmes absorbed this in silence, then extended his hand. Thank you, Gregory. Your reclusion has ended just in time. Gregory took his hand, held it briefly, and turned to go. At the door, he paused. One more thing. Gideon is not alone. He has others, disciples, and one of them is from within the parish. With that, he vanished down the stairs. Holmes turned to me. Watson, pack lightly. Bring your revolver, and don't tell Lestrade. Not yet. If there's a traitor in the parish, we dare not risk a word escaping. Tonight, we travel to Crowsmere. The road to Surrey was long and largely silent. The rattling of the hired landau, our only consistent companion as we passed through shadowed woodlands and rolling, mist-veiled hills. Holmes sat opposite me, coat buttoned tightly, eyes half closed but never idle. Every so often he reached into his coat pocket to feel for something, either the miniature portrait of the unknown woman or the iron key still warm from our recent descent into the crypt beneath St. Ethelstan's. I could not tell which. I dared not ask. It was shortly after 6:30 when the landau turned from the main road onto a narrow, unpaved track lined with ancient oak and elm. The path wound like a scar through the dense countryside, and as twilight melted into night, our destination emerged before us. Crowsmere Hill. From a distance, it resembled nothing more than a grassy mound topped by the skeletal remnants of an old structure. No light, no sound, no sign of habitation. But beneath its deceptive stillness, I could feel the weight of secrecy and something colder still. The landau stopped at the base of the hill. Gregory, who had ridden silently beside the driver, stepped down and opened the door. "This is as far as I go," he said, his voice low and firm. "Follow the slope on the west side. You'll find the sundial half buried in moss and ivy. Beneath it lies the stone hatch." Holmes nodded. "And the current ritual guardian, Gideon. Does he know we're coming?" Gregory met Holmes's eyes with a look I could only interpret as regret. "He suspects someone might follow, but he will not expect you. His pride has always been his blind spot." With that, Gregory turned from us and vanished into the trees, leaving no more than a whisper of rustling leaves behind. We made our way up the western incline of the hill. The ground was soft beneath our boots, muffled by the rich, damp soil of early spring. The moon had begun to rise, thin and white, casting pale light over the grassy crest. "There," Holmes whispered. The ruined sundial jutted from the hill like a broken fang. Its gnomon snapped long ago, its stone base almost hidden beneath moss. Holmes crouched, cleared away the growth with his gloved hands, and exposed the rusted iron ring of a concealed trap door. "Help me with the edge," he said, and together we pried it open. A gust of stale air escaped, earthy, ancient, tinged with something faintly metallic. A stone stairway descended into pitch darkness, narrow and circular, much like the one beneath St. Ethelstan's. Holmes lit a lantern. "From here on," he said quietly, "no words unless necessary. If we are to interrupt a rite, we must do so without alerting them. There may be sentries. And remember Gregory's warning, break the spiral." I nodded grimly, hand instinctively going to the revolver in my coat pocket. We descended. The steps led us deep beneath the hill, perhaps 30 or 40 feet, until they emptied into a wide corridor carved from the bedrock. Unlike the church crypt, this place had been designed for ritual. Carved arches adorned the walls with repeating symbols, the spiral, the eclipse, the veiled face. But these engravings were sharper, less weathered, as if maintained by recent hands. We followed the corridor's curve, light trembling on the stone. Then, faintly, we heard it. A low hum, not quite chanting, but rhythmic, pulsing, as though several voices moved in unison, murmuring syllables older than Latin. We pressed on, moving from shadow to shadow, until the corridor opened into a vast subterranean chamber. And there we saw it. A great circular space, some 50 feet across, lit by torches set into sconces along the walls. At its center, a dais of stone, etched with the spiral we'd come to recognize, painted now in vivid crimson. Around the perimeter stood 8 figures in dark robes, their faces obscured by hoods, their hands raised in slow, synchronized motion. At the center of the dais knelt a woman. She was bound, but not struggling. Her head bowed, her hands clasped in front of her. I could not see her face, but Holmes stiffened beside me. "Watson," he whispered. "That's the woman from the portrait, or her descendant. The likeness is too perfect." "And the ritual?" "About to conclude." He pointed toward a 9th figure at the head of the circle. A man taller than the others, his robe trimmed in gold thread, arms extended wide. He held a small dagger and a goblet, the latter already brimming with something dark. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "That's Gideon, the current RG. What do we do?" He passed me the lantern. "Douse the light. Wait until I reach the far side. On my signal, 3 clicks of my cane. Cut through the circle and drag the woman away. Do not speak her name. Do not pause. Break the spiral." I nodded and crouched low as Holmes vanished into the gloom like a shade. Minutes passed. The humming rose. The dagger was now held above the woman's head. Then, click, click, click. I moved. Drawing my revolver, I dashed forward, cutting through the circle at the spiral's southernmost edge. Gasps erupted. The chanting faltered. I reached the woman, yanked her away from the center, and turned to retreat. But Gideon moved with alarming speed. "No!" he bellowed. "The cycle cannot be broken." He lunged at me, but Holmes appeared from behind, striking the man's arm and sending the dagger clattering across the stone. Chaos broke loose. Figures shouted. One reached for the goblet. Holmes kicked it over. The dark liquid splashed across the spiral, smearing the careful geometry. The room trembled. Holmes grabbed my arm. "Now!" We ran, half dragging the woman, who'd fallen unconscious or into a trance. Behind us, the spiral flared red and then flickered out as if someone had snuffed a flame. The hum dissolved into shrieks. The chamber darkened. We did not look back. We reached the stair, climbed madly, burst into the open air, just as the first streak of dawn broke across the sky. Holmes and I collapsed on the slope beside the sundial, lungs burning. The woman lay still, breathing shallowly. And below, in the hill's depths, silence once more took hold. The ride back to London was one of tense silence, broken only by the clatter of wheels and the low, rhythmic breathing of the woman we'd rescued. Holmes sat across from me in the landau, his eyes fixed on her with something approaching unease. A rare expression from a man who had once stared down hired murderers and political assassins with the same calm he reserved for tying a cravat. She had not spoken since the events beneath Crowsmere Hill. Though her bindings were cut and her pulse steady, she remained locked in a curious state of waking trance, eyes half-lidded, lips parted as though caught mid-thought. I examined her during the journey, searching for signs of injury or drugging, but found neither. It was as if some part of her mind still lingered below, in the chamber where the spiral was broken. It was Holmes who finally broke the silence as the houses of London crept into view. She is not merely a victim, Watson. She is connected to the right in a way Latchfield never was. She was chosen, not seized. Note her calm, her stillness. She did not struggle. She belonged in that circle. Then why save her? I asked. If she's one of them. Holmes shook his head. I said she was connected, not complicit. There is a difference. Recall what Gregory said. The spiral demands an anchor. I suspect this woman, whether by blood, inheritance, or symbolism, was the intended vessel for a lineage far older than she understands. Perhaps she's descended from the woman in the miniature. Perhaps the very first rite was bound to her family. But you said the cult never sought violence until Gideon twisted it. Exactly. Which means this young woman may be the last surviving remnant of a belief system older than its corruption. If we understand her, Watson, we may understand the whole. The carriage rolled to a halt at Baker Street, where Mrs. Hudson, already roused by telegram, opened the door with a startled gasp. "Good heavens, Doctor! Mr. Holmes, what have you brought in this time?" "Something quieter than our usual stray," Holmes said grimly, lifting the woman in his arms with surprising gentleness. "Prepare the guest room. She will need warmth and quiet, and perhaps in time, questions." By the time evening fell, the woman had roused enough to take water and murmur a name. Marion. Holmes received it without expression, made a short note in his journal, and returned to his chair by the fire, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Marion," he repeated later that night as we shared a modest supper. "No surname, no place of origin. But if she is who I suspect, her identity may not reside in birth records. You believe she's from the parish? I believe she was placed in the parish." He reached for a stack of ledgers Lestrade had delivered earlier that day, parish records from St. Ethelstan's stretching back 2 decades. Holmes scanned page after page with the eye of a hawk until he paused. "There," he said, tapping an entry dated 18 years prior. "Marion E., female, found swaddled in the narthex of St. Ethelstan's on the Feast of the Annunciation. Approximate age, 1 year. No note. Taken in by housekeeper Padley. Baptized 2 days later." "Padley raised her?" I asked, astonished. "Not publicly. The child was kept out of sight, perhaps to protect her from unwanted inquiry, perhaps to protect others from her." He tapped the entry again. "Notice the name, Marion E. The E was never expanded. What if it stands for Ethelstan? As in the church itself. Or as in Edith, the woman from the portrait, a relative, perhaps even her mother. If Marion was born of that bloodline, the cult would regard her as sacred, an echo of their original anchor. Her placement in the church was deliberate. She was raised at the heart of the spiral." I sat back, stunned. Then the housekeeper, Padley, wasn't just a caretaker. She was a gatekeeper. Holmes stood. It's time we speak to her directly, and I no longer believe she acted alone. We arrived at the modest row house where Mrs. Padley resided just before 9. Lestrade met us outside, looking weary but alert. She hasn't left the house since the arrest at the church, he said. Claims no knowledge of the girl's involvement. Claims she took the infant in out of pity. And what of Gideon? Holmes asked. Vanished. No trace since the priory. No sign of his real name either. Gideon may well have been borrowed from scripture or ceremony. Holmes nodded. Then we'll begin with the woman who raised Marion to believe nothing was strange. Mrs. Padley opened the door herself. Her face, always lined with wear, now seemed carved from stone. I expected you, she said to Holmes. He stepped inside. Then you won't object to answering a few questions. She led us to the front parlor, gestured toward a tea tray she had clearly not touched, and sat with hands folded. She's awake? Padley asked quietly. She is, Holmes replied, and she remembers her name. Marion, but little else. She wouldn't, Padley said. I made sure of that. Why? Mrs. Padley's eyes misted, but her voice remained steady. Because she wasn't meant to know, only to be. Her mother was part of it, not by choice. Edith believed the spiral was metaphor, not sacrifice. When she realized the truth, she tried to run. Died giving birth. Holmes leaned forward. And the child was left at the church to fulfill her place. She had no other. I kept her hidden, raised her without books of doctrine, without chant or circle. But Gideon, he always watched. Said when the time came, she'd return to the center. She nearly did, Holmes said. And if we hadn't intervened? Padley closed her eyes. I thought the cult had died. I thought if I waited long enough it would dissolve. But Gideon found others. Always do. And who is Gideon? Holmes pressed. What was his name before the mantle? Padley opened her eyes. Rupert Gainsley, she said. A former parish scholar. Quiet, always watching Marion from afar. Took over the veil when Gregory stepped down. He believed the old rites had power, and believed she was the final key. Holmes stood. Thank you. You've done more than you know. As we stepped out into the cool night, I asked, what now? Holmes lit his pipe. Now we find Gainsley, before the equinox ends. He failed once. He may try again. The day of the vernal equinox dawned gray and silent, as though the city itself had drawn breath and held it. A strange calm had settled over Baker Street. Even the bustle of cab traffic seemed subdued, muffled behind the thick clouds hanging above London's rooftops. Holmes stood at the window for much of the morning, pipe unlit, hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular. It will be tonight, he said at last, not turning to face me. Gainsley has no more days to delay. The equinox concludes at midnight, and so too will his final chance to enact the reversal. I looked up from where I had been rereading the notes on the priory chamber. You believe he will attempt another ritual? He must, Holmes replied. His followers scattered, his sanctum compromised, Marion rescued. He has only two remaining choices: disappear forever or finish what he began. And if he's as devout as I suspect, disappearance is not in his nature. He turned and gestured toward the table, where Marion now sat, swaddled in a shawl, a cup of tea untouched in her hands. She looked at us with clear eyes, the strange fog that had clung to her since her rescue now lifted. Her voice, though soft, was composed. I know where he'll go. Holmes raised an eyebrow. You've remembered? She nodded. It came back last night. In a dream, perhaps, but real. I remember going with him. Not often. Once. A small chapel in a glade. Stone walls. No roof. There were markings. I was very young, but I remember the name. Hallowmere. Holmes turned sharply. Hallowmere Chapel. I believe so. That place is ruinous, I said. Abandoned since the Cromwellian Wars, if memory serves. Precisely, Holmes murmured. Its foundations are older still. Roman, possibly earlier. There are whispered tales of altars sunk into its soil, stone circles erased by the Church of England. If Gainsley intends to recreate the spiral, it would be ideal. Secluded, symbolic, undisturbed. Marian's eyes were steady. He will wait for darkness. Holmes looked to me. Then we move before sunset. Lestrade must be brought in this time. If Gainsley intends a final rite, he may no longer care for secrecy. We'll need eyes on every approach. By 6 o'clock we were en route. Lestrade accompanied us in an unmarked carriage, 2 plainclothes constables following behind on horseback. Marian, though Holmes had initially objected, insisted on joining us. She sat beside me, her expression unreadable, her hands folded in her lap like a votive figure in a chapel of doubt. The sun dipped behind the trees as we entered Surrey once more. A thin mist clung to the fields like breath on glass. The road narrowed, then disappeared entirely, and we continued the last mile on foot. Holmes led the way, lantern in one hand, revolver in the other. Hallowmere was precisely as Marian had described it. A hollow ring of stones in a sunken glade, flanked by skeletal trees. The remains of the chapel walls, no more than shoulder height, formed a loose oval. Lichen and time had softened the structure, but beneath the layers of decay, symbols had been etched into the rock. Familiar spirals, eclipses, eyes without faces. Lestrade's men took up their positions around the perimeter. Holmes motioned for silence. We waited. The woods around us grew darker, the last rays of light fading to blue, then black. The moon, a sliver, rose behind veils of cloud. For nearly an hour, nothing stirred. Then, at the stroke of 10, movement. A figure emerged from the trees, tall, robed, walking with the deliberation of a man rehearsing each step. He carried nothing, yet every line of his posture radiated purpose. 2 more figures followed, one carrying a leather-bound tome, the other a sack slung over one shoulder. Holmes tensed. "There," he whispered. "That's Gainsley." He was unmistakable now. Rupert Gainsley, once a parish scholar, now draped in the full vestments of his self-fashioned priesthood. He stepped into the chapel ruin and stood in the center. The others arranged stones in a circle around him, forming the crude shape of the spiral. From the sack, they produced several objects: candles, a broken silver chain, a feather. And then they produced a child, a boy, barely 10, gagged and bound. Marian gasped. Holmes was already in motion. Now Lestrade. With silent precision, the constables closed in. Holmes and I rushed from cover, pistols drawn. Gainsley turned at the sound, startled, but not panicked. He raised a hand and spoke. "You misunderstand. This is not sacrifice. It is completion." Holmes aimed directly at him. "Drop to your knees, Gainsley. Now." The robed man sighed and let his hands fall to his sides. "You cannot stop it. The spiral has already turned." Lestrade and his men surrounded the group. The accomplices dropped their items and raised their hands. The child was freed. Marian knelt beside him, untied the gag, and held him close as he began to sob. Gainsley looked at her with something like admiration. "You are what they were meant to be, the anchor, the daughter of the veil." Marian stood slowly. "And you are a liar." Gainsley's face twisted. "They feared me because I remembered, because I knew." Holmes stepped forward. "You built a mythology on borrowed symbols, layered with fear, and called it belief. You betrayed those who trusted you, used them to satisfy a fantasy." Gainsley laughed once, dry and brittle. "Fantasy? Holmes, I've seen things in the dark that defy explanation." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And now you'll explain them to a jury." Lestrade cuffed him. The man offered no resistance. As we led him from the glade, the spiral of stones broken under our feet, I looked once more at Marian. She stood alone in the center of the ruin, eyes raised to the sliver of moon above. No longer a vessel, no longer a symbol, just a woman who had survived the spiral. The following morning dawned with hesitant clarity, as if the mists themselves had decided at last to lift. Holmes and I sat in the drawing room at Baker Street, both nursing teacups that had gone tepid with neglect. Outside, the street bustled with carts and footsteps, oblivious to the fact that, hours earlier, beneath a ruined chapel, a child had nearly become the final sacrifice in a forgotten ritual. Gainsleigh was in custody, held under high security at Scotland Yard. Lestrade had taken personal responsibility for the man, wary as ever of what might unfold should any of the inspector's superiors begin to peel back the strange details of the case. Officially, the arrest was being framed as the thwarting of a kidnapping with religious motive. The deeper truths, the spiral, the veil, the legacy Marian had unwillingly inherited, would remain off the record. "You seem pensive," I said to Holmes, who sat staring at a blank spot on the hearthrug, fingers steepled, chin resting on his hands. "I am," he replied, "because we've yet to reach the core. Gainsleigh is caught. The boy is safe. Marian is recovering. What else remains?" Holmes turned toward me slowly. "Motive, Watson. We know what he did and even how, but not why in the sense that matters." "To complete the rite," I offered. He shook his head. "Superstition alone doesn't satisfy me. Not with Gainsleigh. He's an educated man, a scholar, a rationalist once before the spiral consumed him. Something led him down this path, and not merely belief in forgotten rites." He stood and walked to the small desk near the window. From its drawer, he retrieved the faded miniature portrait, the woman with the silver crucifix, her smile elusive as mist. He laid it beside a piece of parchment recovered from Crowsmere, one of Gainsleigh's ritual notes, scrawled in ink and marked with the spiral. "Look closely," Holmes said. I did. At first, nothing registered. But then my eyes caught it. Faint in the lower left corner of the note. E.C. Not Gainsleigh's initials. "Eliza Calthorpe," Holmes murmured. I blinked. "The folklorist." He nodded. "Not widely published. A researcher of pre-Christian rites in southern England. She vanished in 1878, near a dig in Surrey. Her notes, what fragments survived, spoke of an unnamed cult, a place called Hallowmere, and something she called the Inverted Church." I felt a chill. "You think Gainsleigh found her records?" "I think he did more than that. I think he found her." He handed me another document, one of Gregory's old maps, sketched from memory. A subterranean layout similar to what we'd seen at St. Ethelstan's, but larger. At its center, a mark, Calthorpe Vault. "If this vault exists," Holmes said, "then Gainsleigh's obsession wasn't just about Marian. It was about her, the original anchor, her body, or her writings, or both. And he believed that completing the ritual would somehow restore her? Possibly. Or that it would complete something she began. Look at the symbols around the vault. Identical to those used in the most recent rite. He wasn't inventing. He was following a buried script." I sat back. "So Marian wasn't the purpose? She was the key." "Precisely." Just then, the doorbell rang. Moments later, Lestrade entered, face pale and jaw tight. "He's gone," he said. Holmes rose. "Gainsleigh?" Lestrade nodded. "Escaped sometime between midnight and 4 this morning. There was no sign of forced entry. The guard posted outside the cell claims he saw nothing, says the prisoner was asleep at midnight. At 7, the cell was empty. No broken locks, no disturbed windows, nothing." Holmes turned to the window, expression unreadable. "Then he had help." "From the inside?" I asked. "Possibly. Or from the outside. There are still others, Watson. Quiet ones. Those who never attended the rites but shared the belief. Lestrade threw his gloves onto the table. Blast it, Holmes. We had him. He was talking. Said something about the hollow light, whatever that means. Holmes froze. What did you say? He asked sharply. The hollow light, Lestrade repeated. He mumbled it before sleep. Holmes turned to me. Watson, the register. Bring it here. I fetched the spiral-bound journal from our last descent into the underground chamber. Holmes flipped through it feverishly, page after page of symbolic diagrams and obscure Latin, until he stopped, tapping one passage with his forefinger. There it was. Lux inanis, the hollow light, that which exists only when the anchor is broken and the cycle ruptured. The spiral undone brings forth the void unless the host is restored. The host, Holmes murmured. That's not Marion, that's Eliza, or whatever remains of her. You think Gainsley has gone back? I asked. Holmes nodded. He never planned to complete the ritual with Marion. That was misdirection. What he really sought lies deeper, perhaps even beneath the priory we thought sealed. And now that we've removed the anchor, the spiral is fractured. In his mind, that has unleashed something. Lestrade looked grim. Then he's more dangerous than ever. Holmes paced the room, hands behind his back. We need to find Gregory. He'll know the original vault sites, places we overlooked. Gainsley won't return to Crowsmere or Hallowmere. He'll go where Eliza Calthorpe went aground, where she became the spiral. Marion appeared in the doorway then, pale but composed. I know where he's gone, she said softly. All eyes turned to her. I remember something else, she said. When I was a child, Gainsley took me to a place, only once, a cavern. He said it was the root of the spiral. Beneath the oldest tree in Surrey, he called it the Ash of God. Holmes stilled completely. The Ash of God, he repeated. An ancient oak said to be over 2,000 years old, struck by lightning but never burned. A Celtic boundary tree, linked to sacred rites long before Christianity. It still stands, and if he's gone there, then it ends tonight, Marion said. Holmes nodded. Yes, tonight we break the spiral at its root. The journey to the Ash of God was undertaken in tense silence, the air around us charged with a weight beyond words. Holmes, Lestrade, Marion and I rode in a single closed carriage through the narrowing lanes of rural Surrey. The sky above us dimming steadily as dusk gave way to night. A crescent moon rode low behind wisps of cloud, and the hedgerows passed us like the blotted lines of some ancient script, one we had been reading, line by line, since the first stain appeared on the altar stone of St. Ethelstan's. The Ash of God stood deep within a forgotten glade, at the edge of a crumbling estate once owned by a minor noble family, long since extinguished by time and war. We had left the carriage a quarter-mile back, continuing the rest of the journey on foot through gnarled underbrush and decaying leaves that muffled our steps. A light drizzle had begun to fall, and the cold clung to our collars like a warning. There, Holmes whispered. Before us rose the tree. Even in the dim light, the Ash of God was unmistakable. Towering and skeletal, its bark was split from ancient lightning strikes, and yet it remained upright. Its trunk so wide it would take 6 men to encircle it. The hollow at its base yawned like a gateway into the underworld. Holmes motioned for quiet, gesturing toward the clearing. In the space beneath the branches, partially obscured by roots and rock, stood the mouth of a descending tunnel, ringed in carved stones and overgrown with moss. Faint light flickered from within. Candles, already lit. "He's there," Marion said. Her voice was a whisper, yet resolute. Lestrade and his constables spread out, circling the clearing with practiced stealth. Holmes turned to Marion. "You stay here. If Gainsley sees you, he may attempt to use you again. We'll finish this." "No," she replied firmly. I began in the center of the spiral. I must see it undone." Holmes studied her a moment, then nodded once. "Stay behind me." We descended the tunnel single file, our boots echoing off the uneven stone. The air grew colder with each step until we reached a chamber carved into the bedrock, smaller than Crowsmere, but denser. Symbols covered every inch of the walls, drawn in soot, chalk, and what I could only pray was not blood. At the center of the chamber was a stone slab, ringed by bones, and standing before it, his back to us, was Rupert Gainsley. He turned slowly as we entered, his face pale but composed. His robes were gone. He wore only a dark tunic soaked from the damp, and around his neck hung a silver crucifix, identical to the one from the miniature of Edith. "You're too late," he said softly. "It's already begun." Holmes stepped forward. It ended the moment Marion stepped out of the spiral. "She was never the end," Gainsley replied. "Only the path." The spiral's origin was Eliza, her blood, her work. She died to map it, to seal it. I'm her voice. I've opened the last door. He gestured behind him. There, built into the stone wall, was a recess, a sarcophagus. Its lid was askew. Inside lay a wrapped figure, long desiccated but intact. A woman, her hair still coiled in braids, her hands folded across her chest, and around one wrist a bracelet etched with the same spiral sigil. "Eliza Calthorpe," Holmes murmured. "She left it unfinished," Gainsley whispered. "I will finish it. Through me, the spiral becomes eternal." Holmes raised his revolver. "No, Gainsley. Through you, it ends." But Gainsley didn't flinch. He moved toward the sarcophagus and reached into its base, pulling free a small volume, a leather-bound journal, worn and cracking. "This is her final writing, her true testament," he said. "She knew the ritual was incomplete. She knew she'd need someone to carry it forward." Holmes stepped closer. "Let me see it." To my surprise, Gainsley handed it over. Holmes opened it slowly. The handwriting within was frantic, scrawled across the pages in desperation. He read in silence, eyes scanning rapidly. Then he stopped. His face went slack. "Well?" I asked. Holmes looked up. "This isn't a rite. It's a confession." "What?" Gainsley blinked. Holmes read aloud. "The spiral is a lie. It is not sacred geometry. It is a human impulse, to impose meaning where none exists. I believed I had found the source. I was wrong. I opened something I cannot name. I sealed it beneath the ash and buried the key within my bones. If you find this, burn it. Let the spiral die." Gainsley paled. "No, you're twisting it." Holmes stepped forward. "She renounced it. She realized the horror she had invited. And you've spent your life trying to continue a madness she recanted." "No," Gainsley shouted. "She was chosen. This is proof. She sealed it because we weren't ready. But now." Marion stepped forward, her voice calm. "Rupert," she said. "She was your great-grandmother, wasn't she?" He stopped, stared at her. "You believed it was your destiny," she continued, "that you were meant to finish her work, but it wasn't legacy. It was a warning." He stared at her for a long moment, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. Then, slowly, his shoulders slumped. The journal slipped from his fingers. Holmes caught it. Lestrade moved in from behind, placing cuffs around Gainsley's wrists without resistance. We returned to the surface together. The rain had stopped. The moon was high. The spiral, at long last, was broken, not by violence, but by truth. The weeks that followed saw the final unraveling. Gregory came forward, providing testimony that connected Gainsley to the rituals, to the hidden network of disciples scattered across southern England. None resisted arrest. Most wept when told the spiral was a myth built on guilt and madness. The journal was submitted to the British Library. its contents transcribed by scholars who approached it not as scripture, but as tragedy. And Marian, no longer a symbol, no longer an anchor, moved into a quiet cottage near Hampstead. Holmes visited her once, bringing with him the miniature portrait of Edith. "She never meant to curse you," he said, "only to protect you, and in the end, she did." Marian smiled faintly. "The spiral ends here." Holmes tipped his hat, as all spirals must.